Hello everybody, Professor I here again. Welcome to my week 5 video musings. So to just sort of recap where we are and what's happening this week, we're up to the 2 world wars now, the beginning obviously World War I. And there's a little reading that you have in our Norton Anthology book that gives you an overview of those time periods and kind of how American Lit fits into that. It's a great reading. And then you have a poem by Amy Lowell, September 1918. And you'll find that one in the Readings tab as well as in the Norton Anthology textbook. What's amazing about September 1918 is that, as you may know, 100 years ago, 1918, we were also in the midst of a global pandemic, and this time it was known as the Spanish flu. And many Americans died from this flu, and as well, we were right in the middle of World War I, and America was part of that war. And so Amy Lowell is writing about the heartache of both the war and the pandemic. And as you read it, keep that in mind. And same thing with New Heavens for Old, also written in the same time period by Amy Lowell. Amy Lowell was an Imagist writer, and so the sheet that I'm going to go over with you here in just a minute is about Imagism in American literature. You also have a couple of works from the very famous poet Robert Frost. You have Mending Wall and Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening. And both of those are iconic works by Frost that you may have studied before. And then in the Week 5 discussion board, you'll consider both Lowell and Frost. And then you have quiz number 3. And the good news is it's an open book quiz, and it's on Chestnut, so the wife of his youth, Washington, Du Bois, and Lowell and Frost. So you want to make sure that you have done all the readings, that you've engaged in the boards, and listened to my video musings before you take the quiz. Even though it's open book, you only have so much time, and if you're not familiar with the readings, you're not going to be able to complete the quiz. If you don't know what we're talking about here, you're going to be lost. So make sure that you have done that. So Robert Frost was not an Imagist writer, but Amy Lowell was. And so if you will, pull up that sheet, Imagism in American Literature Overview. Again, you go to Content and Course Documents, and then to this sheet. So I've said this before, but I want to make it clear again. Do not confuse imagery with Imagism. They are 2 different things. So imagery is a technique that almost every writer in the world uses to create images with words that we envision in our minds, right? That invoke the senses. But Imagism is a literary movement launched by British and American poets early in the 20th century, so the early 1900s. And it's different from imagery. Do not confuse those 2. They are 2 very different things. So Imagism advocates the use of free verse. So what does that mean? No rhyme, no rhyming in poetry. It advocates the use of common speech patterns. So we're not going to use like super elevated language. And very clear, this is the real key, clear, concrete images. So the image is just right in your face, very clear. And it's a reaction to Victorian sentimentalism. So it really gives modernism its start in the early 20th century, and it's considered to be the first organized modernist literary movement in the English language. So Imagism, one way to look at it is that unlike imagery, where yes, we're creating images in someone's mind, the difference with Imagism is it's viewed as a succession of creative moments, a succession of these sharp images, rather than a continuous or sustained period of development of an image. So imagery is a technique, as I said, that writers use across time and genres, and it's built on other literary devices like metaphor or simile. But Imagism is an actual movement in American lit and a style of poetry writing. So the Imagist publications that were appearing between, say, 1914, 1917 featured works by many of the most prominent modernist writers, both in poetry and other fields. And the Imagist group actually was centered in London, so it wasn't centered in the United States, but it had members, writers who were from the U.S., as well as Great Britain and Ireland, who were partaking in the movement and writing in this style. So somewhat unusual for the time. A number of women writers were major Imagist figures. So mostly back then it was just like, you're a little woman, go write your local color, write about Eastridge or whatever. Leave the rest of us men folk writers alone. But women actually succeeded in this field. And so at the time that Imagism came on the scene, Longfellow and Tennyson were like the paragons of poetry. And the public valued sort of this moralizing tone that they had in their writing. But in contrast, and again, notice the italicized portions. They're the portions that could haunt you on a quiz. Imagism called for a return to what were seen as more classical values, like the directness of presentation, the economy of language, this willingness to experiment with sort of non-traditional verse forms in poetry. So the main characteristic feature of Imagism is its attempt to isolate a single image to reveal the essence of that image. So it's not going to go on and on and on about the image. It's going to isolate an image and then isolate another image, and each time reveal the essence of it. So it actually mirrors a lot of what was going on in avant-garde art, and especially Cubism, which I will admit to you I know very little about. Some of you may know a lot more about it than I do. But again, main elements and features of Imagism, if you're asked this on a quiz, the use of free verse, so no rhyme, common speech patterns, more sparse language, so you're not just going on and on and on, right? And a direct sense of just presenting the image. So here's how the Imagists themselves described the features of their writing. Direct treatment of the thing, whatever the thing is that I'm writing about, whether it's subjective or objective. Use absolutely no word that does not contribute to the presentation of this image that I'm trying to create. And as regarding rhythm, to compose in sequence of a musical sort of phrase, not in sequence of the metronome. So when I'm writing a poem, I do not try to make it sound just like this if I'm an Imagist writer. So the Imagists were predominantly young poets working in England and America in the early 20th century, and I list a few of them. But Amy Lowell is the one we're really looking at, and she eventually moved to England. She edited several volumes of Imagist poetry. She believed very firmly in Imagism. So if you're ever asked on a quiz or a midterm or a final, which of these writers believed very firmly in Imagism, you're going to say Amy Lowell. The Imagists rejected those romantic Victorian conventions. Again, they favored the precise imagery, the clear, non-elevated language. And Ezra Pound was very prominent in this movement as well, and promoted a lot of precepts and ideas. And so in a station of the Metro, which is one of the readings we'll be studying, you'll see how short it is right here. Written in 1916, this is often used as a good example of Imagist poetry. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. Boom. That's it. That's the whole deadgum poem. That's it, my friends. Now, Amy Lowell wrote poetry that was generally longer than that, as you'll see. Not super long, but longer than that. But that is a good example of an Imagist poem, and we'll actually be looking at it next week, along with examples of symbolism. So Pound's poem, we could say, was definitely an Imagist writer. It's also using symbolism. It's symbolic of something more. And so remember these ideas when you're posting in the board, and looking ahead to next week when we're looking, more at symbolism. We've got a really interesting poem by T.S. Eliot, Journey of the Magi. So it's about the journey of the three wise men. We have that short little poem by Pound. We have The Snowman by Wallace Stevens, which I love, and Of Modern Poetry by Wallace Stevens, and an introduction to symbolism. And when you first read Stevens, you'll be like, what in the world is this? But when we get into it, oh, you're going to love it. It's amazing and really, really, really deep. So I hope that this has been helpful, and I hope you guys will have a fantastic week.